they teach. I think Stephen is teaching now at Munich and München. And it's been a long in researching on city and domesticity. And I think that links, that's why our interest in your work, in your reflection, in your thoughts. So, but in some way, I think we are close in this affinity. Finally, as I said before, Stephen is collaborating with the next publication with La Casa del Pati. So, for all these reasons, that's why you are here, Stephen. Thank you very much. And now I think you will share your screen. And
yeah, I think Sarah Lopez needs to stop presenting.
I think Sarah, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Right.
Okay.
So, do you see me?
Okay. We see your screen.
Okay, you do. So, do you see this handsome man here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's me. That's me and you in Casa del Pati.
Exactly. So, thank you, Pedro Joan, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. And hello, Pau. I can see you occasionally, but I'm sure there are other people. Welcome to everybody. And I'd like to give this lecture, which is entitled Somewhere Between Tradition and Modernity, as a way, I hope, of contributing to the semester debate and discussion, which is, of course, being the biggest contributor to the structure and the identity. Oh, someone's on the phone. Just to start, I think we need to start by looking at the city in a certain kind of way. By the way, can everyone see this image?
Yes, we do.
Can everyone see this image?
Yes, we do.
Yes.
Yes, we do. Okay, just to check, because I can't see anybody but the image. Okay. I want to start by looking at the city in a certain kind of way. These are a series of photographs of Thomas Struth, who was a student of Gerhard Richter, and he made a number of studies of the city and introducing signs of occupation through this very neutral way of photography. The city is a place of cultural coexistence where different aspirations and inspirations come together. It's a place of vitality and communication. The background fabric, the housing that constitutes the city's origin, brings together people for mutual benefit, mutual support. And the fabric forms neighborhoods. It offers integration, as well as the potential for anonymity. And in acting within or upon it, we should become sensitive to the way building contributes to the quality space and how they can enhance a sense of civility, a gentle civility that can be adapted to embrace both the everyday and the special occasion. And to achieve this, we must engage fully with the ambiguous spaces and thresholds between private rooms and the public realm. We might call that the space between. Your city, a magnificent place, identified so much by the fabric of living, and of course the imposition of the Serdar grid, the 1,000 blocks, the 113.3 meter by 113.3 meter wide block, the streets are 20 to 30 meters, the Eixample, expansion, as we call it in English, outside the old walls of the city. This was in a city in the mid-19th century that was bursting and growing at an intense rate due to the textile sector growing. It had major problems. It established a kind of architecture of the city. Eusebie Bonner's big facades on the Diagonale Montaner, probably not very much loved building, but one that represents so much of what the idea of the city was aiming to be. And that ambition of Serdar was never quite realized as intended, like most master plans indeed. Change, adaptation, breaking of code leads to a kind of complex reimagining of this idea of clarity and of block. One that 19th century painters such as Ramon Casas painted probably consciously, but in the end, the details of the architecture, of the urbanity, are kind of the background to the object of the painting. Casas painting at the cusp of the emergence of Modernisme, an important stage in the evolution of Catalan identity. The Serdar block established a certain typology, an urban typology of rooms, room upon room, very special adaptation, an idea that still holds true today. And areas surrounding the primary grid, the primary ensemble, like El Ravel, which was, of course, an early prototype of a smaller, gentler scale, provides evidence of a finer scale, a beautiful, finer scale to the city. It is a city that I'm sure you feel privileged to be part of. In the Gothic quarter, Plaça de Saint-Philippe Neri, its walls scarred with shrapnel from two bombs dropped in front of the church in 1938 by Franco's Air Force, despite the fact that Franco attributed the marks to anarchists, firing squads, shooting priests. One of those moments of fake news. But such a space, such detail, as architects we have to become acutely sensitive to. We need to observe, and we need to draw, and we need to understand scale, to begin to develop a repertoire of ideas about how to react to the city. But first we have to look at the city really, really carefully and interpret it and understand, in some ways, its origins. For the city is full of narrative. It's clear that the character of a city, defined by never-ending change, is significantly affected by the numerous daily consequences of life, of cultural memory and personal experience, all of which lie within the reality of things, of the things remembered. How do we find a language, an identity for the architecture of the city? One that is thick with the residue of time. Architecture in the 50s and 60s in Barcelona was deeply influenced by ideas being developed in Italy and in Milan, particularly at that time. There was a mutual fascination between the two cities, and that was channeled through the pages of the Milan-based architectural magazines such as Domus and Casabella. The interest in continuità, or continuity, was at the centre of the debate on finding an appropriate contemporary language for urban architecture of old European cities. Gio Ponti and then Oriol Boigas rejected the Khayyam-type grand proposals of large-scale redevelopment in favour of incremental projects that transform the scale and the capacity of the city, while at the same time retaining a sense of its history. There was the idea of maintaining continuity without contriving completeness. There was an avoidance of presenting old and new in contrast to one another. there was a seeking of connections to the city, while at the same time working towards a certain autonomy of formal composition. You could say almost of non-historic continuity and of non-modernist rupture. This was happening in Milan as a sort of poor reconstruction. This image is of the Via Alabrici by Asnago Vender. They were already exploring ideas of construction as a formal, not so much as a technical matter. This is the building during construction. Formal decisions were being driven by specific sensibility for the physical as well as the cultural situation of their projects. A sort of painterly attitude you can see in this wonderful shift of window and a adjustment of proportion as the building rises, an implied tripartite order. It was a sort of painterly attitude, but mixed with a matter-of-factness. You could say a sort of artful pragmatism. And Casa del Patti, built between 61 and 64, the subject of the essay that I contributed as Pere Joan describes, called Betwixt and Between, made by Matorel Boigas Mackay, NBM, is a building of the city as much as for the city. It mediates between ideas of tradition and newness. It has this intriguing quality of the space between, the private world of the inner space. It has an enigmatic and austere facade, seemingly an assembly of parts, with the twisted vertical brick extrusions resting on hammerhead, post and beams, giving a kind of brick battlement. And inside, a space between, still urban, complete with the textures of the streets, but where top light and distance from the street create an otherworldly atmosphere. Its strangeness, the presence of elements that we think as belonging to the public sphere of the city, are placed here beyond the domain of the public. This emphasizes the sense of seclusion. It is a nostalgic interest of the vernacular. The tiles, for example. There are 39 apartments of around 60 to 65 square meters each, organized in a reasonably rational way with two specials, otherwise they're all repeated. Kitchens face the facades with outside space either side. But it's this space between that makes it particularly memorable. It feels like the urge of the architects to connect to the ideas of the old city. The two atrium spaces found through these winding ways, the kind of symbolic placing of the fountain in the basement, are all intended to find resonance with ideas that are deeply embedded in the cultural memory of the residents, of the people. It's a building of the city rather than for. It seems to me to stand on the limits of the known, but one that reaches forward. I'd like to show you 4 projects. Other than this first one, all 3 are ongoing and intentionally shown here because they're not sort of all resolved, you could say, but they demonstrate, you could say, a mutual interest that we have with trying to find an identity for the architecture of the city. And I think of them as there are four categories, you could say. Each project meets a certain kind of type. This is a corner, and there's a block, and there's a sentinel, and these are the idea. And the fourth project has the idea of the inside. This is a social housing project in Geneva, in the old part of the city, on the edge of the Roman part of the city. And it is an empty plot, adjacent on one side, an extraordinary project you can see on the right here by Marc Sauget, called Centre Cendrier. And on the other, on the left-hand side, a really quite magnificent but modest neoclassical school. And the corner site needed an architecture that could mediate between two extraordinary situations. One being the continuity of the street, and the other being an expression of formal autonomy, expressed by the small faceted towers of the slab and tower scheme of Sauget. And we found that mediation in working with a frame, a precast concrete frame indeed, but which integrated a number of facets that gave it a flushness to the street on one side, but the facets give a sense of an object, the reading of an object on the other, and both are bound by the three-story base, which creates a series of colonnades and outside spaces. It is a frame that's inhabited in the sense that there are spaces behind the frame in which outside spaces are provided, because in the lower floors there is a creche for 60 children, local children, and then there are apartments above. Using this precast facade of T's and M's, as we describe them, this is a drawing that we made to organize this assembly of stacked elements that seems to have a classical organization of base, middle, and top, but actually is organized in a very pragmatic way of joining these T's and M's together to create a secondary network of joints. So in the end, it's a sort of integrated whole, but at the same time, it implies a certain classicism. These colors represent different admixtures to the concrete that was seeking to find a match or a loose match with the green stone of Geneva. The idea being that there was a sort of patina to the facade, not a consistent color. But another ambition of the project about knitting into ancient fabric, a fabric that beyond the modernism and the neoclassical aspects of the city, you can see the medieval behind in gaps, in spaces between. It is a fabric, a medieval fabric that ties the back of the city together. You know, the city that you discover when you get off the main streets, a city of passageways and alleyways and small openings, and an integral the beauty of the city, one that we felt our project should link into to extend this network of routes. You can see here this passage leading to the entrance of the apartments in the new project. And in private yards, passages turn into staircases that then turn into small landings that turn into apartments. The passages and stairs is often external but protected from the rain. And we were interested in how we could reinterpret that and integrate that into the project to give this set of routes and ways from the street through the stair, up the stairs, and as you climb the stairs, a new relationship is established with the inside of the block. And as the space is open to the sky, the landings are wide, front doors become visible and shared with shared space that can be taken, by residents as communal space. The apartments are organised as a set of rooms with halls. Either a single hall or a night and a day hall, and the lower floors are organised rather like large apartments of year groups within the creche. And the facade explores this idea of precast, but it's inspired also by this idea of the multiple you can see here by a wonderful project of Klaus Oldenburg called Wedding Souvenir, in which a number of casts were made to create a number of wedding cakes that were gifted by Klaus. There he is sitting there with his wedding cake, offered to guests at a wedding of a friend of his. The plaster is not perfect, and with the 4 different molds, the cake is, in fact, there are 4 cakes made. Each piece has a subtle difference, and this idea of the perfectly imperfect, the idea of multiple not being quite exactly correct, was something that inspired us very much, both in the larger scale facets of the precast, but also the smaller scale softening of corners and edges that give the building ultimately its kind of presence, you could say, in the city. Second project is in Antwerp, and I call this the block. It was the building that we are making is the one in the foreground of this model. The competition was one with 2 other architects, Bovenbouw, who are building on the right, and Bulk, who are building the 3 small buildings at the back of the model. But this block was interested in how to find a kind of strong residential architecture within the context of the water and the dockside arrangement. And in our case, this 80-metre facade was developed around the idea of a bay, a 2-sided bay, that adjusted in relation to the apartment typology, which meant that the projection of the bay subtly moves in and out. And the bay sits on a precast arch, inspired very much by a project you might know in Barcelona, indeed. And that arch, indeed, also has a different height, 2 different heights, that give it a kind of sameness in repetition. An idea that the building, when you encounter it, will feel like it's quietly breathing. It's not absolutely repetitious. We think this is really an idea about the city. Your plan is organised with a narrow and heavily planted courtyard. The car park runs around the ring of the building to allow for full earth, for the planting of quite large trees. And in the middle of the plan, you can see a passageway that leads into and through the block, connecting the block itself with the neighbourhood. This is the block, the view out to the city. These are the blocks of Rojadina on the other side of the canal. And the apartments are organised with a front to back arrangement, sort of narrow and long, with outside spaces integrated into the apartment to give more intimate airs within the bigger plan. Here you can see a 1 to 10 model study of the bringing together of these elements from cast glass, rough concrete, precast concrete arches that came in one large piece. You can see here with a textured facade, textured finish, in which the concrete and the mortar of the very large brick that we chose kind of form a single conglomerate whole. And the passageway on site now with a different lighter brick, which is adjusting itself to the shifting geometry that then unfolds to create these bay windows of small studio houses at the back of the building. Here, recently photographed project. The third project I call Sentinel, and this is a project we're making in Brussels for the so-called Tour and Taxis site. The canal is just down to the south. This is the area of Molenbeek, which is very well known, unfortunately, because of the terrorist incidents that occurred a few years ago. And Tour and Taxis is a sort of industrial site in the heart of the city. There is a large industrial building that exists and is being repurposed. And our master plan, which involved 2 other architects, requires us to make these buildings which are dark in the tone. It's a master plan that is intended to make links to a large park to the inside of the block and to make softer edges to the rising ground along the other edge of the park. And it proposes a series of sentinel buildings within this wide avenue, which is then defined by what we call the Dreef, the buildings, which are large mansion block, red brick facade buildings that use the bay. Here you can see in the drawing below, these are the sentinel blocks that are designed as autonomous elements. Here a study of the Dreef buildings that explore in different ways depending on the architect, because there are 3 architects designing 2 buildings within each of this strip, but exploring the bay form. And the building I wanted to talk about is this one, this gateway building, a building that is actually the only social housing project in the scheme, and the one that we're making. Luckily convinced the client to put it at the pivotal place on the site to protect it from being stripped of any quality because it's of no value to the client. But by making it right at the entrance, it becomes a necessary gateway building, and therefore it can have the dignity that it really requires. Our reference point really was the magnificent and quite exuberant large-scale mansions that you find in Brussels, with confident and beautifully detailed brickwork and really quite strange formal strategies. This is a view against this Gare Maritime, which is this large repurposed market hall, and the building of the latest photograph of the construction of this first building. Here you can see the plan, the manipulation of the bay into a major bay that forms, you can see it as the building rises, a sort of massive, gigantic bay. And in the facade, you can see this organization of the window within the bay becoming quite elaborated in its detail. The entrances have special columns. Here you can see the sample panel where we're exploring different jointing techniques, but establishing first of all this elaborated brick detailing. You can see this rusticated base to the building on site, and then an ornamental lintel detail that both supports the head of the window and supports the base of the window above. And the fourth project I would describe as inside, let's say inside the block, a very special condition that we have in every city, but it's an architecture that we have to find which is not overtly representational, but one that finds a kind of dignity, but within the block, which is therefore hidden. It's a project which I noticed was used on the poster for my lecture today, that started out as a scheme that explored certain type of architecture, and one of seeking quite a formal architecture for the inside of the block. The reality, after winning the competition and beginning to develop the scheme with the city and the developer, was that for legal reasons and zoning and daylight, this project, which was proposing a kind of single cellular structure of rooms, the idea that an apartment became a small city of spaces and linked spaces was fundamentally impossible to get permission for. And it required a rethink and a redesign based first and foremost on what you could actually put into this block and while meeting the legal requirements and the codes for space between buildings and views and massing. And almost as a diagram, the form found itself, a form that was almost difficult to imagine how you could inhabit, with these very striking slopes that provide for the necessary light and rights to view. And with that sort of diagram, we had to reformulate the project. And this sketch, I think, describes it nicely, because at the same time as the change that was occurring, the client bought another building, which was this one. So the original project was here, and then he bought this building too. And so we had two buildings, each that faced the city, and a kind of third building that linked these two buildings, which was experienced only in an episodic way within the set of courtyards that we were forming. It meant a different type of attitude. And, you have to be ready, don't you, to rethink ideas from this thought that the apartment was a, kind of 19th century inspired room upon room organization. What instead we started to think about was an architecture of solids and voids, the apartments being a kind of landscape of almost rooms, some clear solid rooms, but mainly spaces that were not finally defined between four walls. An architecture that's now evolving with the idea of solid and void and landscape. This is the ground floor plan that has studio houses on 2 floors. But as the building rises, the apartment typology, this is one of the benefits of this kind of strange coding and sightline, is that the form is extraordinary. And what that brings with it is the potential to invent spatially interesting apartment types. So the apartments are organized very often along long sequences of movement, along and past things. And as the apartments go higher up underneath the roof, they really become quite extraordinary T-shaped spaces. You can see here with a lot of top light and very little view out exactly, except for in towards the courtyard. And then right now we're trying to work out what is the architecture of this inner block. It's certainly not the equivalent of a 19th century bourgeois facade, but instead more of a kind of industrial architecture, maybe you could say, one that is a representation of the landscape of interiors, a landscape that could be veiled by planting, such that the windows can be very big, but the planting can start to create a kind of veil of addressing the issue of proximity, a veil that in itself has a delicate form to it, like a spider's web that can give us density where we need it and openness where we need it. So we're developing that at this stage. I want to end, although it's quite a long ending, with 3 thoughts. The first one is COVID world. Recent events have changed our perception of what things are worth. Confinement and social distancing, intended to safeguard public health, have the effect of overturning many principles we thought were intrinsic to society. The primacy of work, the growth of the economy, being busy, communing with others. Now we cannot be social now we have to develop relationships with people and places and objects in a new, remote way. Social distancing will upend our way of life through the prohibitions of social gatherings. We will need to relearn a form of social interaction. What will be lost are the spontaneous constellations created by large numbers of people coming together and the social relationships that happen. But we might find new freedoms in these apparent limitations. We're spending more time at home, and this has brought a greater consciousness to these small worlds, no longer a space of transitory rest between other external activities, but now the focal point of our daily life. And this prompts questions about how we should reevaluate the home. Perhaps it should become more complex and rich, a labyrinth organised to offer different routes through and about, where the outside space becomes an integral part of the landscape of spaces. Makes me think of the studio house that we made on a 4 metre by 20 metre size plot, in which the double staircase creates a kind of illusion of complexity. Outside spaces are treated like rooms. There is no centre to the house. In fact, the owners rolled up a carpet and would move it around the apartment for different occasions. It's a questioning of a typology, seemingly modest, but actually quite radical in the way it's organised. My second thought to you guys, as you start your project, is collective living. Since the 70s, there's been a dramatic shift from public sector ownership towards wider private ownership, and housing as a provision has been somehow replaced by the notion of the house as a commodity, something that can be traded. And this has blunted the potential for housing ideas to develop, as they are disabled by needing to conform to common and generic models. According to Eurostat, the average size of households in the EU has been shrinking in recent decades. And this is clearly attributed to a range of factors, including increased life expectancy, declining fertility rates, and the reduction in longevity of relationships. So more people live alone than with a family, or than with a family unit. And yet houses are overwhelmingly planned to accommodate family groups. And this highlights a mismatch between the development of contemporary housing typologies and the needs of the citizens they are intended to accommodate. Generally, standard living provisions are simply scaled down to suit smaller households, the micro flat, the studio flat, which strive to reproduce larger living arrangements that include a bathroom, a kitchen, a boiler, a washing machine, but at a much smaller scale. Ridiculously unsustainable, I would say. I'd like to advocate a more in-depth exploration of collective living, a concept that has been developed in recent years by innovative housing associations and reflects a growing demand from both individuals and family groups for an affordable, shared living environment, which balances the needs for privacy and community within non-familial households. I show a project made by a student of mine in Munich some years ago. In fact, now he's a successful architect in the city. It's a project that he developed as a communal collective living between two firewalls. It represents a radical arrangement for living between a network of open and closed spaces and linking passages, semi-private staircases, a labyrinth for individual and shared use with many options for closing off. Very sort of strong structure. Nothing weak about the idea of organising domestic space, and so refreshing not to see what so often we see with some kind of real estate apartment plans on the walls of the studios in schools these days. The third and final thought I call the house of rooms. I think it's possible to begin to imagine a certain kind of building that may provide a framework for a new collective household. This new kind of building needs to be integrated into the European city, which is characterized by the block and the street and the yard and the square. It should be a large structure of generous rooms and linked passages. Collective sanitary and mechanical facilities would allow for space and cost savings, and can be balanced by the provision of generous interiors for personal and shared use. This communal building would be a big urban house of many rooms, built to last and to stand in the street with robust proportions and a fine materiality. And from the outside, its internal uses are not explicit, but generosity and proportion and material presence would enhance the surroundings and give something back to the city. The interior may recall the large halls of ancient buildings, where generosity of proportions has a lasting character, and windows create a scale one can measure oneself against. Deep thresholds between rooms create intermediate spaces, and poche spaces provide detail, hidden closets, secret linking passages. This is a theoretical project illustrated called by Simon Stevin from 1649, a Flemish engineer, and it's described as sovereign space, a search for kind of autonomous, a set of autonomous but linked spaces for the new kind of burgher, the emerging burgher of the mid-17th century. I like Javier Montes' proposition in this regard, his house with equal-sized rooms based on the historical precedent of a palazzo or farmhouse. As he says, such a house does not distinguish its rooms by the use assigned to them a priori. In fact, its main virtue is that it leaves the decision about how to use them to the user. Floor plans are structured into rooms of similar size without any well-defined hierarchy, so that it is up to the residents to give them meaning. This idea of a suite of rooms stands in opposition to open plan living or continuous space, and therefore defines a different kind of flexibility. The plan itself is not flexible, but the ambiguity inherent in it makes the house adaptable. The house of equally sized rooms does not have a living room with smaller rooms radiating from it. Without a dominant centre, it becomes a honeycomb structure of room upon room, or of almost rooms, interlocking with one another. In such a house, the door becomes a significant element as it activates the rooms, allowing them to be linked or separated, and establishing different views between and through them. A spatial hierarchy of rooms can be established by volumetric difference, through decoration, or based on the characteristics of the door forming the threshold. In this way, different kinds of arrangements can be created without prescribing use. But I would say that I feel not completely convinced by the house of equal-sized rooms, and instead find myself favouring a sort of hierarchy of space, of linked spaces, of different character. This is from 1873, an apartment building in Berlin. The consequence of through rooms and a changing scale and changing light is the reminder that we're not making a diagram, but we're making a world, a small world. A world that architects for 2,000 years have been trying to find. Here, a project for a house of 5 bays by Palladio from 1546. Bob van Rieth, Belgian, the original Baum of Flanders, reminded us when he referred to the intelligent ruin, of the importance of designing buildings for an unknown future. Buildings should be useful, suitable, usable, reusable, and with a strong physical identity. They should be an expression of an economy of means and an economy of energy. They should support ideas of a social sustainability and act as carriers of culture and guardians of cultural continuity and collective space. I leave you with a quote of one of your special heroes, Raphael Moneo. If architecture is established with firmness, it will remain open to new interventions which prolong the life of the building indefinitely. The life of buildings is supported by its architecture, by the durability of its most characteristic formal means. Although it seems paradoxical, it is this durability which makes change perceptible. Respect for architectonic identity is what makes change possible, what guarantees its life. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Stephen. Thanks to you.
Okay. Did everyone hear that? That was all okay?
Yeah, it was perfect.
I just see lots of names.
Especially, I was really with the end, with the three thoughts, especially astonished because you gave us a lecture and also some advices for the students. So I think they can be very useful. These final three thoughts, I think they are really addressed or how to start. The idea of collective, the passing time, how buildings should take the time, and I think are beautiful. I don't know, Stephen. Maybe can we have these final three thoughts? Do you have it written?
Yes, I have them written. Of course I have them written.
Because I think really can be useful for students. I don't know. Well, first of all, we want to thank you to be here and for the brilliant and useful lecture. I think we like to see your buildings and your projects, all of them, but also really the final thoughts I think can be very useful for students. I don't know, before I ask them, anybody has some question, even we can do it with some of the professors of the course or maybe some student. You can open your...
I see some nice familiar names and faces. Yeah. Javier, I see. Well, hello, Javier. And Jordi, we seem to have a life that we never meet each other, but we just talk a lot on Instagram. And Pau, your lovely beaming smiley face, yeah, all that energy is great. But I think it sounds to me like the studio has some great teachers for a really good semester. I thought the introduction was wonderful, Pere Joan. I think you called it a sort of quite prosaic brief, but it has the essentials that students of architecture need to address in a kind of serious way. But my strong plea to you as students is to think beyond the conventional, because none of your teachers are going to be interested in pushing your plan around on a sketch, when it's not interesting, doesn't provoke a conversation. So I hope that this lecture gives you, say, a bit of confidence to challenge yourself, but also challenge what people say is required in housing. But if you strip back to essentials and maybe think of these three prompts in the last part of the lecture, the plan has got great potential. And I hope to see at the end some good plans.
I think there's been many point of context. I mean, you talk about the scale, about time, about collective spaces. I think they are really keywords for our course. This relationship between city and housing, I think, is is mainly how they connect through. Also, the idea of empty space and public space, I think, is present in your work. I don't know. Any question? Pau, Jordi, Xavier? I think Stephen is asking for a question or for a comment.
I'm here. I'm ready for questions. But if there are no questions...
I don't have any question, but I want to thank you for this inspiring lecture, Stephen.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jordi.
Yes, thanks. It was fantastic, Stephen. And maybe I thought it was very interesting here at the end when you were making this kind of ambiguity between the kind of equivalent rooms adaptability, which is quite a strong potential for a space. But then you said, oh, but I'm more interested in the hierarchy of spaces, no? When you make them specific, when you make them. So I think this discussion is really interesting. I was wondering maybe if, like, the last project you were showing, the one in Munich, is there like, are you suggesting in that project, for instance, that there's this potential of overlaying like a very robust, ordered, like structure, like a kind of permanent thing versus the soft kind of domesticity through these divisions which are not even aligning to the structure? Is this kind of this overlay of two different walls? Is this kind of a suggestion of what
I think in a way, in the facade there is it's ongoing, but there is an interest in a sort of mismatch to provide a very necessary screen, you could say. The plan, which is more clear to us, I think that I showed the project because of the possibility that form, which slightly was sort of imposed. We basically filled the air with what we could inhabit, and ended up with a very strange form, and that was legally compliant. And then that gave us an incredible freedom, actually, to invent plans. And then you start to invent an idea of domesticity. So the plans are about really about a landscape of space. You kind of walk a lot. And I was thinking, it's part of this COVID thought about spending more time at home. For me, it's quite interesting to consider how the home can become a more, I don't know if this is the right, you'll understand me when I say this, but a more complex world. And I don't mean complex like complicated, but I mean more layered and more of an experience than I think modernism simplified plans to a kind of extreme extent. And then, of course, the open plan means that when you open the front door, the whole of the domestic realm is displayed to you and any guests who might arrive. And I'm thinking to myself that one of the lessons we can learn by spending much more time at home is realizing that it is in the end our world. And do you want to reveal your world directly to anyone who comes by? Or do you want to walk exactly in the same way between rooms every single day, 67 times? In other words, could you find a more experiential idea of living through the plan? So I'm really interested in that. And I think that the equal size room story, you see it by fashionable and often very good architects that make these drawings, and by theoretical architects who talk about room upon room. But I favor this hierarchy, which is about understanding that the domestic realm consists of differences as much as similarities, as much more realistic and much more comfortable. So while I, like probably everybody else, I love those plans, room upon room. But I sort of, over the last few years of studying them, feel that in the end they're quite limiting, and that's why I don't mean to end up always in the 19th century. I've got to say, I don't know why I do, but I can't help myself. I end up back there. I think it's about breathing. You know, when you breathe, there are rooms, there are spaces between spaces, there are deep thresholds and transitions. It's to do with this experiential understanding of how an apartment works, even a small apartment, because you got to work with 60 square meters probably, or between 40 and 75 square meters in your semester. But that isn't an excuse not to explore the potential in the plan. I think to myself, I live in a house with 3 grown-up children now. Their room is their world. When they were little, they could have a tiny room with a little bunk bed, and that was fine. But now they're in their late teens or early 20s, and that's their world. And their room is as important as the living room, let's say, of a standard apartment. Why do we have this? Why do we have this hierarchy in relation to use? Because what I didn't say is earlier is that my interest in hierarchy is not through use, but through volumetrics. Yeah. So remember, I never talked about the use of the space, but I think to myself that we need to react to a real life contemporary situation, and projects like this allow young architects to start to declare their experience a bit more, trust in their experience, and challenge the convention. That was a long answer.
So, what else? Xavi?
Xavi.
Just a second. Well, when I read about your architecture, I always have not doubts, but some kind of feeling about the ornament. So I'm very impressed for the work with bricks and a lot of things, and this concrete structures and this kind of things. But sometimes I feel like a strong effort to create the image of the building or the image in the city of the building, thanks to a strong work with ornament. So it's not a question, it's just a feeling of an atmosphere that surrounds always when I read some of your buildings, not all of them, but for example, you've shown some brick fabrics.
Yeah.
With a strong effort. I like it, and I if I saw it on site, I really love it. But it's I don't know where is the edge between ornament or aesthetic and is necessary. That it's not. It's a little simple, my reflection, but
I understand that. I understand the hesitation somehow. I mean, I guess I would answer this by partly, calling upon my culture, my cultural autobiography somehow. I mean, I feel something extraordinary happened in the late 19th century in the third stage, the sort of third generation of the arts and crafts movement, with the works of Letheby and Voisey, amongst others, that was pre-modern, So they were working in a pre-modern situation, but industrial and technology was innovating fast. And what I see in their work is incredible confidence to compose, to compose facades, to work quite freely with architectural language and style, to make reference to the historic city in quite a, almost with bricolage, almost like a kind of composition of form and detail. And in reality, the buildings are very powerful in the city. They somehow provoke thoughts, but they are also embedded by making those kinds of associations. And given that I was also educated through the 80s, through the period of postmodernism, in which my teachers would never accept any ideas of postmodernism, but would only sort of ram down my throat modernism, i.e., architecture seemed to start in the 1930s when I was a student, as opposed to 2,500 years ago. I left my education with a skepticism towards modernism that was fueled also by becoming developing an allegiance to the ideas of the Smithsons, for example, and that encouraged in me an openness to forms and attitudes to architecture. And I think that some of the work that you see is an investigation into that the idea that, as Venturi describes, form becomes important and representation becomes important. So there's partly a kind of resistance to this function-based architecture, you could say, that was proposed from the 30s onwards. But I would say that more recently, the notion of the intelligent ruin is becoming more and more interesting for me. The project in Antwerp is a case in point where you might call it ornamentation, or the adjustment of things is occurring through a set of multiple reasoning, but very often not or form being only one of them, and a subtle ordering that feels necessary in a big facade. I find that my idea of ornamentation is changing. So in the end, I always think of architecture as an investigation, a personal one, but one, of course, with a public responsibility. And I am just I don't want to be tied down by a doctrine that we all have. And I think in Catalonia and Barcelona, there's a very powerful influence of modernism over anything else. And I think that that's fine, but that's where you all have your autobiography too. But I'm ready to explore the edges of that, you could say, and try and work things out, in this way. I don't need to minimalize everything or strip everything to nothing. Sometimes that creates a sort of impotent result. And I think in your work, Javier, I know that you do look at old buildings, or some of you do anyway, and then you find a language through the materiality of the detailing and you could say a meaning or a kind of justification for the work you're doing. And I find it very often very beautiful. Sometimes I would ask, is it domestic? Is it understandable to non-architects? Can it be embedded in the city? These kinds of questions I would, in a way, offer back to you. Because in the end, what we all do as architects is try and work things out, don't we? And try and do the best we can. So yeah, it's an interesting reflection that you make.
thank you for the answer.
So, any other question? Maybe some student has something to ask. So, Stephen, thank you very much. I think
Pleasure.
we've been overwhelmed by the work and the thoughts, the reflection. I think very accurate, and they really are in synchrony with our teaching and our thoughts. So can be useful, and we really appreciate them.
Okay.
So,
Well, good luck with this. Good luck with the semester, and maybe I'll see the results somehow.
oh, would you like to come? We I mean, online.
if
We have a mid-semester exhibition and a final. So I'll write to you and
Sure.
I'll ask.
As long as you don't mind the English language being used, maybe
No.
that's okay.
Okay, that's not a problem. I think the students speak better than we do. So
Well, okay.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure for us. Thank you for coming.
Really great to see some faces and to look at your study and your library and your studios behind you, all of you.
Okay.
Okay. Bye-bye.
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 Bueno, jo crec que tenim encara uns 160 assistents. Podríem concloure la sessió. Jo crec que emplaçar-nos aquí dimecres. Ho hem dit, però ho torno a recordar, que dimecres us enviarem un altre i penjarem a la web i a Atenea un altre link de Google Meet i tindrem una sessió, diguéssim, dedicada a explicar més específicament el lloc de la clota, l'exercici, el planejament, les referències i alguna intervenció. Per tant, tot això passarà dimecres. Recordeu que heu d'omplir la fitxa des de la web i penjar-la